Okay, good morning everyone. My name is Chris Payne. This is a talk about visual storytelling because it's something that I'm really interested in. And so I'm going to kick off with a little bit about me to give you a little bit of background for where I'm coming from and why I'm giving this talk, and then talk a bit about cinematography as used by Hollywood in linear media, because they've developed a lot of tricks that we can still use in interactive media, and then talk a bit about how those tricks can be applied in interactive media. So it's primarily TT Games working on all of the Lego franchise, and for the last 5 or so years of that I was working on all of their camera systems, and so all the tools that the artists would use to position the cameras and get them to behave as needed, which was quite tricky, especially with the split screen. So that's what I worked on for the last bit of that. But also, I've done a fair bit of amateur directing, and I'm very interested in visual effects, cinematography, and the last couple of years I've set up my own studio to try to converge those interests and do some games that are original and a bit more cinematic. So, linear cinematography, the very first movies were basically filmed plays. The legendary train pulling into a station, which apocryphally had people fleeing the theatre because they were worried that the train was going to come through the screen and crush them, because they'd never seen a moving picture that wasn't real before. That was just, these were just films of interesting things. It took not that long for people to start doing more interesting things with the form. That shot at the bottom there is a film called Come Along Do. It's the first film with a cut from outside a museum to inside a museum. So they started developing the visual language to stitch different scenes together. 1911, the first example of a close-up. That film was called The Lonedale Operator, and in which a woman on a train foils bank robbers using what looks like a gun in a wide shot, and at the end of the film it cuts in for the punchline that it was never a gun, it was a wrench. So that was a gag that only worked by cutting in close to show the prop. And then the year after that, it was the first example of a close-up used for emotional reasons in a film called Friends, which is an interesting Western in which a girl is torn between her boyfriend and a dashing stranger and sticks with her boyfriend, but decides in the end that she's not all that happy about it. So early films were quite interesting. By 1928, we had some really fantastic use of close-ups for emotional reasons, and in fact this film called The Passion of Joan of Arc had an entire village built to film on, but then the director filmed it almost entirely in close-ups. Apparently the investors were very unhappy that their expensive village was not particularly visible on screen, but I think you can agree that that close-up is a much more powerful image than a panorama of a village. So, framing in cinema is, I presume you're probably familiar with the basic kind of setup of long shots, medium shots, close-ups, and so on. But that broadly correlates to a level of intimacy with the subject. So, if you have an extreme close-up of someone's face, it usually means that that person is very important, and quite often, if it's really close, it means that you're pretty much inside their head. If they're someone distant, if they're not an important character, then you don't tend to get close to them or don't see them full frame. So what the camera pays attention to and how closely the camera pays attention to it is a very important signifier of how important that subject is to the storyline. David Lean makes great use of framing in films like Lawrence of Arabia, where the characters are frequently framed incredibly tiny on screen to make the desert seem enormous by contrast. In The Matrix, they use a lot of very kind of rectilinear framing, so the camera is square onto the environments and so on to create a sense of artificiality for the Matrix scenes. But you can also use framing in much more emotional story-driven ways. So, for example, Tom Hanks here is cornered in the frame and trapped in the same way that his character is cornered in the storyline. And in a famous shot from The Graduate, Dustin Hoffman is completely trapped by this seductress. Focus is an interesting artifact of film cameras that has been kind of co-opted into a feature, really. It's more of a bug that it's quite hard to get perfect focus on the entire shot when you're looking at something close up. But it actually looks very attractive, and it kind of mimics the way that the human brain doesn't focus on things at multiple distances simultaneously. So focus is often used to draw attention to the things that are important, and obviously focus. This shot is from one of my short films, and it's about to be a focus pull to the girl in the background who's whispering something. But it's a great way to draw the audience's attention to what you want them to pay attention to. And it's also useful, even when you're not pulling focus, to show, for example, in this shot from the King's Speech, the microphone is really important. You don't want people to be paying a lot of attention to it. So the combination of the microphone dominating the shot, but the focus being on the actors' faces, is a great way to combine those two things to show the kind of the threat of the microphone. And lenses, as well as focus, lenses are useful. They can change the look of things. This is the same guy with a variety of different lenses from different distances. It's effectively a bunch of stills from a vertigo zoom, which is named after the film that Hitchcock used it in. But that's been used to great effect to create like very wide-angle shots, create a kind of weird, skewed view, and Terry Gilliam and Tim Burton are both fond of using wide-angle shots to make things look weird, but also a long angle kind of compresses the distance and flattens things down. So in this shot, the gun is compressed right into his face, and it's a good way of putting things that seem a long way apart close together. A lot of chase sequences, you'll get a long shot of somebody running in front of whatever's chasing them, say the T-Rex in Jurassic Park, and there could be a massive distance between them, but by using a long shot, it compresses the frame and looks like the T-Rex is directly behind them. And here's an example. This is Band of Brothers, and this is a fairly wide shot of the group compared to a long shot of the group, which compresses them all together, even though there's the same number of people in the frame, but they are much more kind of grouped together as a company in this shot than the previous one. Camera position is really important. Here's an example of a wizard looking weak and a child looking powerful, even though both of them are pointing weapons into the camera. So the relative position of the camera establishes a sense of dominance or weakness, which I'll come back to later. And camera movement is a really interesting thing. The Wachowskis did some wonderful stuff with The Matrix and some of their other films, which has been broadly adopted by Hollywood generally, for using slow motion and or even like freeze frame to freeze a moment in time and then examine it to show the importance of that moment, usually. Sometimes when it doesn't work, if there's no story significance to the moment that is freeze-framed, then it feels gratuitous and visual effectsy. But in this example, it's the first time that Neo is able to dodge bullets the same way that the agents do, and that makes it significant in story terms, and therefore not gratuitous. Other forms of camera movement. This is, as far as I know, the only example of a vertigo shot with no subject, or rather the subject is just the background, which is a really clever idea because it creates a very uneasy sense of that space warping to foreshadow the appearance of the Nazgul on the path. That's from Fellowship of the Ring. But you can also do very interesting things with camera movement. David Fincher, if you watch all of these clips from Fincher movies, you'll notice that the camera follows the actors really, really closely. Every little movement that they make is tracked by the camera, and that has the effect of putting the viewer in sync with the character. It makes that character stand out from amongst the rest of the cast because they are the one that the camera is paying attention to. But it also means that every movement that they make, the camera moves with them, and that puts the viewer in sync with that character. This shot, that last shot of Daniel Craig, is the tiniest little camera movement. It was almost not worth it, but that's the sort of attention to detail that Fincher puts into his films. Visual juxtaposition, obviously, again, David Lean contrasting like an enormous mountain with a tiny little column of people. That's a great way of conveying the relative importance of things in the frame. And temporal juxtaposition is comparing things over time rather than in the same frame. So this is here's a classic shot from 2001 of the primeval ape discovering a weapon for the first time. And so we've got, again, a shot looking up at the ape who's suddenly become powerful as he discovers this weapon. So he batters at the skeleton, then he throws it up into the air, and we cut from the flying bone to a spaceship over 4 million years, which is a great contrast of the primitive ape with the supposedly more advanced humans of our future. So in terms of, that's a very rapid summary of some of the tricks that Hollywood has developed over the last 100 and something years. There's a lot of other stuff. There's other interesting tricks, like if you frame someone's head with a space behind them, then you're creating the impression that something is going to come and fill that space. There's also some like even more subtle things about bad guys generally coming in from the left of frame, good guys from the right. That may be more of a cultural thing. But there's a lot of little tricks with visual storytelling that Hollywood has developed. Now, in interactive terms, it's a bit trickier. If we have control of the camera, then we can do beautifully framed shots, like this one from Life is Strange, that look just as good as film, and they're using, we've got depth of field creating a shallow focus there on Chloe, and we've got lots of, the background is just out of focus, not important, but it frames the two characters and it shows their relationship. But most of the time, you want something more like this, which is much more practical for actually doing things like combat, exploring an environment, remaining oriented. In terms of remaining oriented, for example, another Hollywood trick is the idea of crossing the line. If you have two characters having a conversation, you imagine a line between them and you stay on one side of it, because if you cut from one side to the other, then on screen it looks like the characters have just swapped round. And that's visually confusing. So you try to avoid doing that. It can be done deliberately to create that effect of it looking confusing. I believe in iRobot there's a shot in the interrogation scene where he's interrogating the robot, where it cuts from one side of the table to the other deliberately to like swap the man and the robot on screen. And if you understand why you shouldn't do those, then you can use those tricks to do it on purpose. So the necessity of being able to show the player what they're doing and what is around them kind of constrains what we can do with the camera. So Divinity Original Sin, because the game is built to play like Diablo from a top-down perspective, they've had to do things like put portraits in so that you can get a better look at characters' faces because the figures are very small on screen. Now, part of that is because the game is built that way because, and that they put the portraits in because you could cut in, for example, like The Witcher, you could cut in and do nice over-the-shoulder things. To do that, you have to put an enormous amount of detail into the characters. I mean, look at the stitching on that woman's shoulder and the attention, the plaits and so on. That's a massive amount of detail you've got to put into a character, which Divinity Original Sin doesn't need to do because they're always a fixed size on screen. But even if you have got that amount of detail, in The Witcher, for example, here's a beautifully staged screenshot of a fight scene, which looks cool, but it's not terribly practical because you can't see who's behind Geralt. In practical terms, you really want something that looks more like this, which is not terribly attractive, but you can see everything that's going on. So it's impossible to always marry those two conflicting requirements. One of making beautifully framed artsy compositions and practical displays of what's going on in the space that the player is occupying. So framing tends to be practical in games. Gears of War did an interesting thing by putting, Resident Evil also kind of pioneered this, by putting the camera behind the character so that you can see the character that you're playing on screen as well as being able to see where they're looking. And even to the extent that when you zoom in, it still keeps them on screen, looks right over their shoulder. It makes you quite intimate with that character, again, because it's a close-up, but it allows you to see what's going on, and it gives you a good sense of what the character's doing. But, of course, when they want to do something a bit more dramatic, they will break with that practical framing and move to a much more dramatic framing for a chainsaw duel. Camera movement is interesting. In this shot from Uncharted 4, I think, the camera's pulled way back from Nathan to make him look smaller compared to this massive wreck that he's discovered. And I believe that's Tomb Raider. As Lara comes out of a cave, the camera is looking upwards to create that sense of moving into a bigger open space. So camera movement and positioning can really help to sell changes in scale. This action scene from Uncharted 4 would work perfectly well with a top-down perspective, and that would probably be quite practical in terms of like showing the player exactly where they are, where they're going, what's going on. But it's much more dramatic to have the camera close up to the character and tilted a bit, juddering and shaking as they're dragged along the floor, because all of those things contribute to the sense that the player is controlling that character and the player is in that situation and sharing that experience. Directing attention is a tricky one for games because we can't control the camera like a film can and just pull focus to the thing that you're supposed to be looking at because the player might be interested in walking somewhere else. Journey handles that in an interesting way by pulling the camera back but leaving the player with control. Because Journey is Journey and there's nothing to attack you for the most part, it's okay for the player to even wander off screen during those scenes where the camera has floated off, it shows you a big bridge, and then it will come back to the player once you've seen that the bridge is there. Gears of War handles that in a different way by giving you a button prompt to say sort of like, yes, I am happy for the game to show me something. Is it on there? There's a Y button prompt to look at a dramatic cutscene if you are willing to do that. If you're in the middle of shooting something, you just don't press the button. You don't have to see it. So there's a simple sort of like branching choice to allow the player to decide whether the game is going to take over the camera or not. So, oh yes, and of course, BioShock famously did a very good job of directing the player's attention without ever taking control of the camera, just with clever level layout and positioning shadows on the walls and teasing the player with characters sort of scuttling across the end of the corridor and then disappearing, all sorts of tricks like that. So in terms of storytelling then, I'm going to get into some examples of games that have done really nice things with the camera. This shot from Life is Strange is a lovely example. It's not. It's more a composition than specifically the camera. But this is a lovely shot where Max and Chloe have just been reunited after sort of years apart, and they're kind of trying to sort of figure out what footing their relationship is on. So they're kind of, visually there, those train tracks going off into the distance kind of like imply a journey. The two of them are going in the same direction, but they're each on separate rails and they're balancing, which implies uncertainty. The visual language in that shot is fantastic. And mild spoilers, you have to save Chloe from a train. But after you save Chloe from the train, it's contrasted with this shot, which is almost the exact same shot, except that now they're on the journey and they are together and they're in the middle of the track and they're moving on. And that visual juxtaposition is a fantastic storytelling moment. Dutch tilt. Dutch tilt is basically this, where the camera tilts slightly sideways. It's often sometimes called the Batman angle because of its massive overuse in the 60s Batman series. But it's used really, really well in Arkham City here, where there's an entire chapter where Batman is poisoned. And over the course of the chapter, the camera slowly tilts from upright, as normal, to about a 20-degree angle. It's not a lot, but it's just enough. And you still have control throughout this, but just the camera is tilted. And it's really unnerving. But as it gets more and more pronounced, it really can, and obviously it's supported by Batman's animation changing and sort of like screen effects happening as well. It really conveys the sense that Batman is ill and you're not, things are not normal. There's Journey's full of lovely camera work and story moments, obviously, but one of my favourites is this moment at the end of the slalom. The slalom is a fantastic moment of exhilaration and speed and progress and satisfaction because you're moving forward, you're moving towards your goal, and you're heading down the hill, and just as you get to the fastest and most exciting section of it, the player is framed helpless and small there against their goal, but they plummet into the cold darkness of the underworld as the camera then pulls back into the normal gameplay mode. And the music supports that, the lighting supports that, but it's a beautiful camera cut there to kind of like show you your goal and then snatch it away. Now, this is a lovely moment from the first Tomb Raider reboot from 2014, which I'm going to go through in detail because it's one of my favourite scenes from the game. So this is your standard dramatic rope camera, where you're not doing anything else there, so the camera can do something custom. Now we've gone back to normal camera here, and then you go to this ladder. Now, custom cutscene, show the character's face, show that she's a little bit nervous, and she starts climbing. So you have to push the stick to climb up. It's taken away a lot of your other controls. All you can do is move upwards. So here it's starting to show you the surroundings and how high Lara is. Jump scare there, brief cut to show her the character's face again and the height below her. And she climbs up, and then we're at the top there. So she climbs on, and we're now back to, we're showing the height, showing that she's a little bit nervous, and then we've gone back to, now player's in control, we've gone back to that default angle. So you start climbing. This time they put the jump scare right at the start of the climb. They haven't blurred the background there so that you can see the detail of the level that you've been through and how far you've come. She climbs all the way up there, and now she's even higher. And now the animation sells that she's frightened, and the camera moves around to show why she's frightened. And yeah, my wife couldn't watch me play this. So now you've got the last bit, and she's off screen now, and you're climbing up, and she's not even on screen because that was basic ladder stuff. But you can see the goal. We've got hero shot on Lara. She's going for the goal, but there's this challenge ahead. You can see the gap there. So now the camera's moved above her to make her look weak and uncertain, and that's supported by the animation and that really tense bit where she makes the jump. But because as she's got past the jump, we've now cut to the hero shot of her arriving at the top, and we get a lovely pan round there. Interestingly, amusingly, there is a magic rope slide that appears after that shot for you to get down from. You can see it in the main level, it's just not in that cutscene. But that's a fantastic example of really intensive use of the camera to support the narrative of that challenging climb. Now, you can also do that with multiple characters. So this is an example from God of War. It's the second boss fight of the game. I've tried to keep it minimally spoilery. There's no sound, so. But it's very interesting to watch the way that the camera frames the characters involved to show the changes in the relative sort of power balance in the interaction. Obviously, it's a fight scene because it's God of War. The whole of God of War is beautifully done in a single camera move. The entire game, the camera just transitions smoothly backwards and forwards between gameplay and these beautiful cutscenes that are all shot as if there was a cameraman in the game with them filming it. And that's a fantastic trick because all those little camera wobbles and the way that the camera moves as if someone's really holding it adds verisimilitude. It makes it look a bit more sort of documentary styled. But they have done some wonderful things with the lighting and framing as well. So there we go. The camera's sort of like running over there to get into position for the next stuff. They've done some very clever stuff with moving the camera first and then allowing the characters to come into shot, which is pretty good. So now there's a stranger at the door. We don't know. We follow Kratos up to it, and then we get the reveal of the stranger, and he's pretty unassuming at the moment. Kratos towers over him. We know Kratos is the god of war. We wouldn't be here otherwise. But he's got some attitude. So he's giving Kratos some lip. So you can see that Kratos is framed huge in frame. He's taller than the stranger. He's bigger. He's very powerful. And but the stranger is not intimidated by this. Kratos is trying to go, and the stranger starts getting. He gets the full frame now as he's out and out insulting Kratos, which we know to be a bad idea. So he gets to grandstand a little bit because he's doing something pretty ballsy. Now, Kratos comes back into shot, and he casts a massive shadow over the guy. And again, he's huge, he's intimidating. It's like, why? And then the camera over compensates for that punch. Now, this is a really interesting thing. As the camera comes round the two characters, it moves down lower, so that the two of them are level eye to eye. So even though Kratos is still like 2 foot taller than the guy, it puts them on a level playing field. Now he has a go at Kratos. Interesting that they pulled the camera back a bit so that you couldn't see Kratos going to catch the fist there, so it came as a bit of a surprise. Now we've got a hero shot of Dark Kratos. He's not going to be restrained now. He's going to kick ass. And again, he's got the power at the moment. He's picking the guy up. And then this happens. Now, the camera, I love the way that the camera is almost like thrown after Kratos and just lands next to him. The cameraman then picks it up and moves it out of the way. Hero shot on the stranger who has the power at the moment. So he does that stomp, and then the camera pulls back to the standard gameplay position, which cues the player to take over and start fighting. I've cut that bit out. There's quite a lot of it. It's very good combat, but the camera doesn't change that much. Now, this is interesting. Watch the camera go wide angle as he flies up in the air. That makes Kratos look small relative to the rest of the environment. Now, the stranger has the power there. We get a long, lingering shot of the two beds through the hole, because that is the moment where Kratos, the stranger, realizes that Kratos is protecting somebody inside the house, and Kratos realizes that the stakes have been raised. Player has control at the moment, not full control, don't have the full range of movement, just left and right fists. So he punches him a fair bit, and then we get this transition. The power's now with the stranger again. I love the way the cameraman legs it across the gap there. It frames Kratos there in the foreground with his hand on the weapon that he's about to use. Now the camera follows Kratos through here and powering through. Kratos clearly has the upper hand here until the stranger slams him to the floor. Now Kratos is on his knees, he's weak. The stranger has the power as he heals himself, which doesn't look good for Kratos. And they fight again. Again, look, the camera moves with every punch in the same way that Fincher moves with the characters. Right, the stranger has just pummeled him into the mountainside. This shot frames the stranger with Kratos' face and fists, because his fists are really important to the Spartan rage that he's about to trigger. There we go. So now he's got the power again. So he is basically, the camera moves with each of his punches. This is lovely. The camera attaches to his weapon, and he piles him through the mountain and into a monolith, which he then rips apart. And then he pushes him back. We're back to the gameplay camera again. Now, there's not a lot more of this. Right, there's a lovely slow motion bit. Now watch the camera moving with every punch here. The camera just sort of it reinforces every hit to really show that Kratos is now back in control. So he throws him down. The camera looked with Kratos up at the monolith to show what he was looking at. So he dumps that on him, and the mountainside falls apart. And now we're back to the player being in control, and they can walk away. And I'm not going to spoil any more of that. But there's some wonderful camera tricks all the way through that game, doing interesting storytelling moments. And so the key points that I'm basically trying to get at is that we can't always marry the two requirements of showing the player what is going on and also telling the story. Sometimes you can, but most of the time you've got to transition backwards and forwards between the practical side of things and the artistic storytelling side of things. So it's really important, if you're wanting to tell stories visually, to have the tools in place to make it as easy as possible to do those transitions and be able to make a custom shot that will really sell the power of this boss. Even 2D games do it, where the camera, for example, when you get in a 2D scrolling game, you get to a boss section, what will generally happen is that the camera will frame that boss fight space with the floor at the bottom and sort of the full height of the screen for the boss to occupy and the player right down at the bottom. Makes the boss look powerful, the player look small, and it's also very practical for keeping everything in frame. Don't be afraid to limit the player for story moments. So in those examples, when Lara was climbing the radio tower, it took away all of her other abilities. All you could do was go up and down the ladder. If you go back down the ladder, you go back down to the platform and you can stand around a bit. You can only drive the story forward by climbing the ladder and doing what the game has scripted, because that moment is a linear story beat. Similarly with Kratos on the roof, you get the opportunity to punch the stranger, but you don't get the opportunity to throw your axe at him or run around or get your shield out or any of the other abilities that Kratos has, because the game is focusing the player, and the players don't mind that. They're happy to sort of like roll with the story as long as they're doing something fun or something interesting is happening. And bear in mind the many tools at your disposal. There's all sorts of interesting tricks being done with the camera in Hollywood. Still, they do things that are surprising, but I've forgotten the example I was going to use. But even after hundreds of years, filmmakers are still coming up with interesting ways to frame shots that we maybe haven't seen before or haven't seen in quite the same way. And I've got a few minutes left if anyone has any questions. Yes?
Hi, well, thank you for the talk. Lots of really cool points in there. One of the games that really, I think I first noticed a lot of the camera movement in it was Amnesia: The Dark Descent. And it used kind of the vertigo shots and stuff like that to represent kind of incoming madness.
Yeah.
It was interesting because the first time it happened, it was like, whoa. But then after a few times, it was like, yep, that's that thing again. How do you try and find the balance between being the kind of the storytelling thing and kind of mechanics delivery and just overuse and kind of oversaturation of kind of showiness?
I think it's all about balance, really. I think, I mean, in that example, if you have a very dramatic camera move or camera effect and you use it constantly, then it becomes very obvious. You can either have a very dramatic camera move and use it sparingly, in which case it feels special when it does come up, or you can have a much more subtle camera move that you use all the time, so that it's still having an effect, but it's not necessarily obvious to the player. It's not really a camera thing, but I've noticed playing Overwatch, when you jump or land from a drop, the lower half of the HUD vibrates slightly with the impact. It's really subtle, and probably a lot of players have never noticed it, but it's a little tiny thing that reinforces that sense of movement and landing. So I think it's just about being restrained and balancing it.
Thank you.
Anyone else? We can wrap up early. Oh, yes.
Hi, thank you very much. I was wondering, I love that games are becoming more cinematic and you're getting lots of beautiful film-like moments into game. But as you say, those come at a loss of immersion because you take control away from the player.
Yeah.
What good practices can be done for making the actual gameplay part cinematic, for adding excitement while the player still has control?
Yeah, I think there's... I didn't really dwell on those a lot. I think Journey has some fantastic examples of adjusting the camera during gameplay to suit things. So there's a lot of like pulling the camera back to leave the character very small on screen to give that David Lean sort of scale. And that works really well in Journey because it's easy to pick the character out in that bleak landscape. And also there's not a lot of threat. It would be difficult to do that in God of War if you were still in the middle of a fight. And also because the environment of God of War is far more detailed and textured, and there's a lot of more visual noise there. But it's possible to do a lot of these things with the dynamic camera. There's some tricks. Uncharted is full of interesting tricks. Largely, you can only do it when the player is doing something where you know that the player is constrained in some way. So, for example, if the Tomb Raider example, there we go. So this rope camera, you know that the player's on the rope. They can't do anything else. So you can give them a camera that is dramatic for that particular application.
So I'd say in that moment, the environment constrains them, and you can then have fun with the camera.
So you can take advantage of moments like that where sort of like, well, you know that the player is going to be like busy doing something. Or for example, I mean, a common one is if Kratos does his Spartan Rage, for a moment he's playing his power-up animation. While he's playing the power-up animation, there's nothing else the player can do. You can get away with flying the camera around, moving it into a new position, that sort of thing. So you can take advantage of those moments where the player is naturally constrained by gameplay and do something interesting with the camera.
Thank you.
Yes?
Thank you very much. Great talk. I was just wondering, you showed a lot of examples of how games are mimicking cinema and how they're still evolving themselves within cinema. Games are mimicking that and using it for great ways to tell a story. But you just touched on it a little bit then. With games, with the virtual world, the sky, we can do anything. We're not limited by a camera on a tripod or dollies or whatever you want to call them. Not cinematographer, sorry. Do you have any examples of, or do you have any ideas of how games will innovate with cameras?
I think there's a fair amount of that already. Interestingly, with a lot of the cinematic cutscenes, what we tend to do is try to mimic Hollywood to the extent that animators will build camera dolly rigs and dolly tracks in Maya in order to constrain the camera to behaving in a way that looks like cinema. So it looks like it was really filmed, because as soon as you start flying the camera around in ways that you know that the camera couldn't really do, it starts to look fake. And interestingly, Hollywood tries to go the other way, where it'll try to do sort of like stuff that is very clever with sort of like one continuous take, or there'll be, for example, there's a lovely Steadicam shot in Pulp Fiction where the camera follows Bruce Willis down the side of a house and through a kind of tear in a wire fence, and it's absolutely rock solid and silky smooth, and it's just basically a Steadicam operator climbing through the fence after him with all the stabilization taking all the movement out. But Hollywood likes to do those things because it makes the audience go sort of like, oh, how was that done? And in games, that's not very impressive because we know that there are none of the physical constraints, which is why stuff like the camera flying through the goblin caves in The Hobbit looks very CG. I mean, apart from the fact that 48 frames per second made it look like a video game anyway, but then flying the camera through caves in a way that was obviously not physically filmed made it look even more fake, even though the caves themselves were sort of like good CG, but it felt a little bit fake. So in terms of actually innovating, game cameras do some interesting stuff. At the end of the day, it's basically just like it's an angle to look at the character from, and Hollywood has kind of tried most of those different angles and found all the ones that are interesting and work. But there's some good examples, like the original Alone in the Dark was the first one to start doing kind of like really weird third-person angles, and that worked really well for horror because it was slightly unnerving for the player to be like watching the character from overhead at a slight tilt. It made the controls a little bit clumsy, but that worked for horror, but it wouldn't work for God of War. So there's issues like that. I mean, the earlier God of War games did a lot of dynamic camera movement where they would try to frame Kratos and all the people he was fighting. But those games used a much more side-on camera, so it was much more similar to the Lego games where the camera would just track alongside the level, even if it went round in curves. It was still basically a linear level that wrapped around and so on. but it would try to automatically frame everything that was on screen, and that's something that Hollywood doesn't have to do because they know what's going to be on screen. They don't have to dynamically adapt to it. But it'd be interesting to see. I mean, I haven't touched at all on VR, which is an interesting one because.
I asked about that, but I thought.
Yeah.
Worms open.
It's it kind of takes all of the all of these tools away from you, and you just have to work with like the environment and audio cues, visual cues, and stuff in the environment because you cannot mess with the camera. So that it's a very different language, more like theatre than film.
Thank you very much. Oh, and also thank you for the analysis of God of War scene. I've seen that a few times now.
Yeah.
I've never noticed the cameraman run back after Kratos. That was brilliant.
It's cool, isn't it? Have we got time for one more? Or? One more. Sorry.
Cool, thank you. I'll try to make this quick. Out of curiosity, we're looking at a lot of these camera movements that are very scripted, very deliberate. In a game, say for example, looking at something like Far Cry 2 or something that has a little bit more of an emergent style of storytelling, are you familiar of any examples, or where do you think it would be with the opportunity to maybe say a AI-driven cameraman that follows the player around and is able to sort of make choices on where the camera should be with that type of effect?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I'm going to go to a slightly more comfortable example because I've not played the Far Cry series, but with the Lego games, I mean, what you're describing is basically a chase camera. Yeah. With the Lego games, once we started putting free roaming hubs into the Lego games, we needed a proper chase camera that would follow the player around. And it's really, really hard to make a chase camera that will work in every setting, and to make it work in Lego worlds where so it's a chase camera in a completely editable world, so we couldn't put any kind of like manually placed cues in there at all. It all had to be driven by just analysing the environment. That can be quite difficult just to keep the camera out of walls and floors. There's tricks that you can do if you know that the player's gone into a confined space, because you can shoot raycast out and go, oh, this is quite a tight space. You can pull the camera closer in so it's less likely to cut through walls and stuff like that, and it also gives you a claustrophobic sense. Other tricks that we did is when you are in the Lego games, if you are Iron Man and you are flying around, if you do a boost, it'll do the usual sort of like flare the field of view temporarily and then slowly bring it back so that you get that sensation of speed. The wider the field of view is, then the faster things seem to whip past the camera. So flaring the field of view, most racing games will do that as you speed up because it increases that sense of speed. So you can do tricks like that, and then there's things like Hulk leaping about. We had to do a very special camera to follow the Hulk when he did a big jump because he moved so fast that the normal chase camera couldn't keep up. We had to write special rules for the camera to follow him like the camera following Kratos over the house, and then sort of like land and do a camera shake and settle into the normal chase camera position. So there's a lot of things like that you can do that are driven by the player actions and reinforce what the player is doing. But obviously, also in Lego, we would, for problem areas, because it was the bulk of the hub areas were not editable, we would put custom camera volumes in to say sort of like, if you go into this phone booth, we're just going to sort of like put the camera here, so because that's a good angle on the phone booth, because you can't get the camera inside the phone booth with the character without it clipping through something. So there were cases where we would just override it and say sort of like, or sometimes it would be for gameplay. You need to climb up this series of ledges up the side of a building. It's going to be a lot easier if the camera just settles to a fixed viewpoint that gives you a good angle on that. Sometimes we would fail. And there was a few examples in Pirates of the Caribbean, some jumping across posts that you did diagonally, and that was almost impossible to do because it's very hard to judge a diagonal angle with a thumbstick. But we learned from that and didn't do it again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we're out of time now, aren't we? Yeah.